Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you here today to the Bloomsbury Set's first virtual conference. We have a range of sessions throughout this week, and we'd invite you to attend as many of those as you would like to join us for. These sessions will be recorded and they'll be available on our platform for you to catch up on, or if you're unable to attend live. The format of the sessions throughout the conference will take place as short presentations, keynote talks, and panel discussions on a range of topics in the fields of One Health and infectious disease, knowledge exchange, and innovation. We'll also be bringing in some of our speakers to discuss the interdisciplinary nature of global health research, and we invite you to submit your questions through the chat box. Today's talk is all about interdisciplinary knowledge exchange to tackle global health challenges. We have two fantastic keynote speakers joining you in this session, and I'll be giving you a short introduction to the Bloomsbury Set, which is the conference's organizer and host. So if I move on to the introduction on the Bloomsbury Set, the Bloomsbury Set was funded by Research England as part of its Connecting Capabilities Fund. This was an initiative that was first called for in 2017, and its intention was to support collaboration. This summary here is actually from their midterm review, which was published in 2020. And if we see their definition of collaboration here is the intended joint working between universities and business, and between commercialization professionals and knowledge exchange officers to share capacity and good practice. I think for a lot of people outside the university sector, they may not be so familiar with what knowledge exchange actually is. So I'm going to take here the ESRC's definition for knowledge exchange, and that's a two-way exchange between researchers and research users to share ideas, research evidence, experiences, and skills. It refers to any process through which academic ideas and insights are shared and external perspectives and experiences are brought into academia. And that's the important thing when we start talking about knowledge exchange, is this is actually a two-way discussion. It's not about universities telling people what they should be doing. It's not about businesses just asking for what they need. It's actually a two-way, iterative, collaborative process. So if I then move on to what the Bloomsbury Set is, its focus is connecting capability to combat the threat from infectious disease and antimicrobial resistance. And the core partners in the Bloomsbury Set are the four colleges listed below. And if we just sort of take that, infectious disease and antimicrobial resistance, even if you don't know a lot about these colleges, you can already see that there's a range of expertise represented there. We've got human health, we've got animal health, we've got the social sciences coming in, economics, politics, trying to bring these STEM and SHAPE subjects together under a collaborative platform to enable change and improvements in how we look at infectious disease and antimicrobial resistance and the knowledge exchange and innovation within that. This is the Bloomsbury Set's focus. We are an interdisciplinary program supporting a One Health approach to deliver major human health benefits, improvements in animal health, welfare and productivity, and in biosecurity and food safety. And the second paragraph there sort of goes on to describe really what we're about. We're about connecting people. If we're thinking this knowledge exchange thread running through these programs, it's about connecting people, businesses, ideas, bringing things together in a bit of a melting pot, really, to help develop these real world solutions. And our specific focus in that was better diagnostic tools, new vaccines, and better models to understand infectious disease and AMR. As I mentioned, there are the four partner colleges, and we also work very closely with LIDC in our initiatives. When we say interdisciplinary, what do we really mean? It's bringing those different voices to the table. And I think what we've really seen in the last 12 months with the COVID response is it isn't just science, it isn't just policy, it isn't just funding. It's actually bringing those together to have those discussions in a real community of practice feel. Now, I'm going to take the prize for the first person to mention COVID during this conference. Whilst it isn't our focus, it is quite a nice example of what we mean by interdisciplinarity. This is just a screenshot from some of the latest in health articles on New Scientist. And you can see the different types of topics that they're discussing there. I think the vaccines always dominate the news stories. But what you can also see there is the other aspects from Shape and STEM that are so important when we're actually addressing this type of global issue. And I'm sure within those, a lot of our delegates will see the topics that you work on represented in that. So continuing with what the Bloomsbury set does, One Health. So this is also a term that's definitely becoming more familiar in our vocabularies, but isn't always something people know in too much detail. So really it's about implementing these programs, communicating together to have a better public health outcome. This isn't my definition, this is the WHO's definition, but it talks about how it's relevant to food safety, the control of zoonotic diseases, which isn't just COVID, there's unfortunately quite a lot of it about in the world, but also combating antibiotic resistance. So you can see how that's embedded in the focus of the Bloomsbury set. So the three topics that are always sort of linked together are the human, animal, and environment. But another way of thinking about this in terms of One Health is the different players that need to come together. So you need the institutional players, the technical side, but also the social. So this is bringing One Health and interdisciplinarity to the forefront. I'm going to talk a little bit now about what the Bloomsbury set has done. We were established in 2018, so we're just over halfway through the programme, and we were initially funded through to 2021. And in that period, we've had 5 funding calls, we funded 30 different projects, we've got over 72 different investigators across those projects. And they're not just academics, there are commercial collaborators, there are some NGOs in there are designers. And again, it's about bringing those people together so that the sum is greater than the parts. We've actually spent close to £4 million in a range of pump priming projects. And the next slide just gives you a little bit more detail about what some of those funding calls have been. So we funded project grants, innovation fellowships, commercialization awards, AI and data science awards, and social science awards. But really, what does that mean? So as with any funder, there are different criteria for those calls, but ultimately these 4 boxes on the right of the slide describe what the focus of the Bloomsbury set has been about. And that's developing low-cost diagnostic tools to provide solutions. It's also about looking at the social, economic, and political acceptability of these public health responses. It's developing new vaccines as an alternative to antimicrobial use. And it's also about looking at that modelling, that large data sets. How can we use machine learning to actually improve these models of infectious disease? What I've picked out on this slide is actually some of our interdisciplinary projects that are quite interesting. So if we just take the middle of those 3 examples, this is looking at a citizen science approach in Sri Lanka. When we talk about infectious disease and AMR, it isn't just a UK problem. I think we've all seen that quite clearly over the last 12 months. But this project is actually working with on-the-ground volunteers who are helping to collect data for our academics. And it's about continuing that dialogue with the right players. The next slide just picks out some of our innovation fellowships. This was a specific call for fellows who were developing new tools and diagnostics in the space and are collaborating with companies. So our 3 fellows have been supported to develop these new technologies. We have Laura, who's working on fast diagnostic tools for infectious diseases in cattle. We've got Ben, who's working on a bacteriophage technology, which could be applicable in both human and animal health, about TB infections and rapid diagnostics on site. And then we've got Kevin, who's working on a neglected tropical disease, which is actually a zoonotic malaria parasite. And again, looking at an assay that could improve diagnostics and treatment in that space. Now, that's just a very light flavour of what the Bloomsbury set has been doing for the last 2 years. We have published a brochure, and we've also published a case study report. These are available on our website, along with the videos and recordings from this event and some of our other symposia. So please do take a look at that resource. Follow us on Twitter or look us up on LinkedIn, because we would love to connect with our delegates. So I'm just going to bring things back now to the setting of the conference. So hopefully seeing why the Bloomsbury set might have brought together people for this event this week, you'll see where our interests lie and why this is so important. This next slide just picks up some of the many, many headlines we've seen where coronavirus has dominated the news. But actually, there are lots of other zoonotic diseases that our academics are interested in, and academics around the world. And Jeremy and Joyce will touch on some of those, as will our speakers later this week. But I thought it would be interesting to see how public understanding or public interest in this space has shifted a little. And these are actually the most common Google search terms since the Bloomsbury set started in 2018 compared to last year. So 2018 seems a long time ago, where the most important things on people's mind were the World Cup and the royal wedding, through to 2020, where 3 out of the top 5 were all related to an infectious disease, because this has actually brought home to many people outside of this space how important this can be and what an impact it can have on our lives. I've mentioned a few times that it's not just about COVID. These are actually some of the top hits, I suppose, of infectious disease outbreaks from the WHO in the last few years. We've seen only this week another Ebola outbreak. We've also seen in 2019 the publication of the next UK government antimicrobial resistance plan. So these are very much current topics that are going to be important in all of our lives for the next few years. And that's why we're bringing people together from an interdisciplinary background to think about these questions and how knowledge exchange in One Health can make a difference. So before we move on, I would like to say some thanks to all of the people who've contributed to the development of the programme this week, our organising committee members, and of course the many speakers and presenters that will be joining you over the week. The core Bloomsbury set team, without which none of this would have happened. So Dr. Sarah Rhodes, Dr. Adalia De Paula, and Dr. Ray Kent, and also the members of our steering group, both past and present, who've contributed to developing this agenda as it's evolved from a face-to-face meeting planned for last autumn to the virtual platform that we're hosting this week. As another reminder, this is the conference programme, some of the topics that we'll be discussing, and we would like you to join us. Registration's available online, and the recordings will be available after the conference. So I'm now going to move on to today's keynote speakers, and we're joined by Professor Joyce Tate, who's the co-director of the Inogen Institute, and Dr. Jeremy Salt, who's the Chief Scientific Officer for GalvMed. Jeremy is going to be our first speaker, so I will hand over the controls, Jeremy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me to speak a little bit about GalvMed today. So I can just start off maybe by describing GalvMed's our objectives and the history of the organisation, because I think it's a nice example of what Emma was just describing, of an organisation working in a multidisciplinary environment, trying to translate science into product effectively. So our focus is on sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. The basic concept of GalvMed was an observation made some years ago that publicly funded science at the bench level was not necessarily making its way through that translational part of the program through product development and access and availability for interventions in the field. So GalvMed started following this observation by an interested group of people back in 2006. And the idea was to try to identify where these gaps actually occurred, where the needs of the small-scale livestock producers in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia really was, and look at some of the barriers for actually taking some of the science that was being conducted through to the field. The partnerships we operate therefore span this whole spectrum right the way through from more basic research through to the application of research, marketing activities, socioeconomic impact assessments, and ultimately sustainable delivery mechanisms, primarily, not solely, but primarily through the private sector animal health company delivery. And we've matured as this time has gone on, but the basic principle remains very much that idea that we are an organisation that de-risks some of these development activities that maybe have not been the most attractive areas for the large international animal health companies to operate in the past, to try to de-risk that financially and also through resource inputs, to try to get better use of science and turned into products and used in the field. The basic point for us is we use our donor funding to de-risk these programs, whether it's product or market development. And then ultimately, these activities are handed over to private sector partners. We have an exit point for all of our projects, and that's very clear before we start them, that we identify that and then we adhere to that. So on the next slide, I think there's a little bit more information about the organisation itself, just to give you some idea. So as I mentioned, we're a not-for-profit organisation. The original funding for GaldMed came from UK overseas aid through the old DFID organisation, now part of FCDO in the UK. And then quite quickly after the original feasibility study, the recognition by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Livestock Group that there was a real need for this type of translational activity, bridging between research and delivery in the field, again, focused very clearly on the small-scale livestock producers in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And that has remained our mission. We're a relatively small organisation in the sense that we have a small core staff, but we do depend on a large ecosystem of other partners, whether that's on the science side, the marketing side, or the socioeconomic side. And that still remains the same to today. We actually have an administrative office up in Edinburgh, and we also have operational offices in Nairobi on the ILRI facility, if anybody's aware of that, and also in New Delhi, just to help us with our field activity. So next slide, please. So our vision and mission has been refined recently. We're continually evolving as time goes by into slight modifications where we see the need from when we first started all those years ago. So the vision is a more expansive version of the vision that we originally started with. So although we work in animal health primarily with products for animals, there is always the intention there to make an improvement to people's well-being, their lives, their nutritional status, etc., through improving productivity in their animals. Now, on occasions, we do also work on true One Health disease issues, such as Rift fever, which is already mentioned, and also porcine cysticercosis, where there is a potential intervention in livestock, which has a direct health benefit potentially for the livestock keepers and people living around these animals, not just an improvement in the productivity of the animals per se. But basically, that has been a version of our vision and mission for this whole time. We work with the private sector, both regional and international companies, and that's something I'll come on to as we move through the presentation. And if we can go on to the next slide, just to give you an idea of how we have evolved. The initial program was funded by UK aid. This was a feasibility study. And then very soon after that, we embarked on a joint programmatic funding where primarily in that first 5-year period between 2008 and 13 was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and UK aid. And that was primarily around product development, pure and simple, where basic publicly funded research technologies were developed into usable products in the field. And that took up most of that first 5-year period. We also had a small aspect of capacity building in the regions where we were partners on an European Commission funded VACNADA program. And we also took on a very specific project, which I'll come back to, which is our largest single project, which is a very multidisciplinary project to develop a new trypanoside for use in sub-Saharan Africa. So the programmatic funding cycles continued on then, and an element of market access was the next add-on, if you like, with a recognition that product availability was very clearly needed to be assessed very carefully in the context of availability and sustainable delivery, which is, so in our middle 5-year programmatic funding, there was a greater emphasis on market access. Making sure that we were actually creating products and that they were available to the smallholder farmers. And then latterly in this third program, which we call Vital, the one that we're currently in the middle of at the moment, there was an even greater emphasis on the commercial development side of this. So actually establishing small distributor companies, looking at the financial complexity of building sustainable companies, looking at break-even points within our programs, and the other expansions that have taken place in the meantime. We've built in other diseases, so brucellosis and FMD have come in with a wider range of donors who've recognised us as an organisation who could operate in this sphere between research funding and translational activity, and ultimately product availability in the market, in the field, to try to make a real difference to people's livelihoods through improving the health of their animals. So that's where we are currently, and we're working on a new strategy. On the next slide, we've just got some basic information about the funding that we've received. So as you can see there, the total funding sort of between 80 and 90 million of the programs that we're currently working on. The bulk of that money has come from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, partnered alongside the UK aid. We have this one very large separate project away from the Vital funding, which is a program to deliver 6 new vaccines. We have this separate pharmaceutical development program with a fairly sizable budget, which may surprise people, but I think if you've worked in industry, it won't surprise you, the sorts of budget that has to be set aside for these commercial development programs. The Last Mile project is a further extension of what we've been doing, working with one of the large animal health companies, Boehringer Ingelheim, specifically to look at different ways of sensitizing markets, making sure that we're catering correctly for the end user requirements for the products, and getting these products actually out into the field in a sustainable fashion. And on the next slide, we've got a little bit of a breakdown just to show you approximately how we can operate as this sort of small core organisation with a large array of partners. So we're only spending 6% of our overall budget on overheads. The bulk of our funding is either this programmatic funding, the Vital programme from Gates and UK aid, and also a large component of this separately funded new trypanoside project. And then the breakdown within GALMED, again, just to show the various multidisciplinary aspects even within our organisation. R&D still comprises, at least financially, the biggest component of GALMED in terms of overall spend. Our commercial development activity is now an increasing part of that. We have some direct project related costs, our overhead still remaining at 6%. But then the two areas really that we still maintain and see as vital to our ability to perform in this area, monitoring and evaluation function, which is becoming an ever increasing emphasis for what we're doing, and also our policy group, which works with various policymakers as part of our enabling environment activities to try to make sure that the social aspects of what we're doing are acceptable and legally based in the countries we work in. So I think we could move on to the next slide, and what we can see. So from our point of view, when we're talking about the application of science to try to improve livestock productivity and ultimately benefit people's livelihoods, we're really spanning this whole continuum right through from the research area, where we're working with multiple partners at the academic level, right the way through to the more conventional product development activity, which we do with commercial partners, with some of the large international clinical research organisations. Product registration activities, we have a capacity within the organisation to work to advise people on the regulatory side of getting their products through the registration process. We've had a program over the years for actually establishing a harmonized regulatory activity, particularly within East Africa, because that's been seen by several of our commercial partners as a barrier for them to take part in this particular marketplace, and to try to make it more comprehensible for them, more like what they're used to working in other parts of the world in the higher income countries, to try to attract their participation in this particular field. We obviously have to work with manufacturers, and this has been an aspect of our work to try to improve overall quality of the products that are available for the smallholders. And then ultimately working also with distributors and retailers right down to the customer, who is the farmer at the end of the day. So that's the spectrum of activity. And on the next slide, it just tries to summarize what the basic value proposition is. Whereby we're saying the basic proposition is that for somebody who has relatively valuable livestock, so looking in this case at a goat at approximately an average cost value of around $50 if you were to sell that goat, then the proposition is to invest a small amount of money for, in this case, a PPR vaccine at 10 US cents. Then the way that we operate is to make the case that that level of investment, even for a small-scale livestock producer, offers a good return on the investment. It's a relatively modest cost for a relatively highly valuable unit, which is valuable to the family in all sorts of ways, both from a well-being and potential livelihood developing attributes for the family. So the next slide is just really lays out with greater complexity, what we call our theory of action. So for us, we're truly operating across that whole value chain, which obviously brings in quite a lot of these disciplines. So from my point of view, the department that I represent, the R&D group, we're working with largely publicly funded research. Doesn't rule out the possibility of working with privately funded research as well, and research institutes, to take technologies, and then our role is basically to de-risk those, to find commercial partnerships for the academics who may be working on these technologies, to negotiate an agreement for access to these technologies, and then to work our way down through the value chain. Within GaldMed, we also have the other disciplines, including our commercial development group, who are then looking more at the distribution networks in a sustainable fashion, either to develop new networks, if none are in existence, for the small-scale livestock producers, or potentially to work with existing commercial partners to develop those networks to take on that particular segment of the market. And then in addition to that, we have an enabling environment group who are looking at the regulatory and government policy areas, so such things as the recognition of community animal health workers in the field, who in certain parts of the geographies we work in take the role of veterinary surgeons who are not always available in the field to assist people with these interventions in their animals. And there are a lot of issues there about the recognition and training of these paraprofessionals. So that's another area that we get involved with apart from the registration activities. And the growing area for us now is the monitoring and evaluation, which is a group that we've developed over the last 2 or 3 years, particularly to try to evaluate the ultimate impact that the interventions that we're having, to measure these in some meaningful way that they can be reported back both to the donors, but also to allow us to modify our activities based on the outcome of that monitoring and evaluation. So I'll continue now just to talk a little bit about product development activities. So this is an area the R&D group represents. So we have these 4 segments within GaldMed, and what we have done in each of these areas is to try to identify the gaps or barriers that are maybe preventing the private sector in its broader sense from getting involved in these particular markets And then we try to address these, define them, de-risk them, and then bring in partners who can then take forward the translation of this research into products and interventions. So on the next slide, it just shows a little bit of the workings of the way that we've done this in the past. And a very basic question in the early days, of GalbMed, when you look across this whole spectrum of activity from discovery research right out to ultimately having sustainable delivery processes in the field for the small scale livestock producer community, it's possible to identify particular areas that were lacking. And in this one, we particularly focused on the product development aspects. So one of the key ones, obviously, is the de-risking and the cost of companies who may have a complex portfolio of competing investment opportunities, and trying to look at real ways to bring people into this market, to bring the power and the capabilities of the private sector into this market, and looking at areas that particularly are disincentives for them, and then seeing our role is then to try to come up with constructive ways of de-risking these areas. And this is basically what we tried to do on this slide. So, a lack of investment, a lack of facilities, sometimes specific technical challenges related to the markets we're working in, which may be peculiar to those markets, and that can be from a product point of view, it can be from a delivery point of view, and quite often it ends up with there being quite an overlap there. What we have tried to do in our more recent activities, particularly on the market side, is to look at consolidation of demand, which is something that is a real issue in the geographies that we work in, where the demand is very disaggregated. It's difficult sometimes for commercial companies in their standard evaluation processes to understand the market, which they can't readily measure because the data just isn't available. So what we've tried to do is identify these areas and then build that data, which may then be available to attract partners in, as well as just working with them on particular product development activities. So a sort of maturation of that to some extent on the next slide was, we've been, at the moment, we're just going through a strategy review, and we've been revisiting some of these areas because obviously this is a dynamic environment that we're working in. It was an area that was largely unserved by the major multinational animal health companies over the years, the pharmaceutical companies. But obviously that changes, and with the encouragement of particularly the Gates Foundation, Livestock Group, and through ourselves as well, it's quite clear that there is increasing interest in these particular segments of the market now with the larger companies. So it's always worth going back and revisiting what some of these barriers could be. Again, barriers which act as disincentives for the animal health companies to come in and serve this particular sector. So we've had a recent exercise again looking at the various aspects of this, right from the basic upstream barriers right through to product development activities, including all of some of these areas that I've already mentioned, and then the commercialization barriers. And in fact, also the real downstream market side of things, where we're seeing that there are all sorts of issues there about poor quality of product supply, lack of sustainability of product supply. All of these things we try to build in when we're considering particularly new projects that we may be going to take on, and trying to be sympathetic across the whole range of activities, right through from the science side right up to the end user view of particular technologies, to try to find areas that we can improve to make these products more sustainably available in a useful fashion. So the next slide really portrays, I think, how we like to see ourselves, that we are a facilitator, if you like. GalbMed doesn't own anything. The model that we operate, again, I'll come on to slightly later, but basically we operate on a model where we facilitate and don't own. So we try to make arrangements whereby the science can be translated and used usefully in the field. We don't derive any income stream from any of this activity. It's purely facilitatory. So where we see ourselves as that central piece in the jigsaw is trying to bring together some of the actors in this particular field, whether they are the academic research groups, the funders themselves. We act as a way for a reasonably efficient means for the funders to direct funds to the research community, and then also to partner in with the animal health sector as well. And the other key player there is, of course, is the government and community service organisations who have a say in quite a lot of these diseases in terms of disease reporting and disease control, and potentially as the market creator, if you like, for publicly controlled diseases where governments are offering tender opportunities for supply products, and that's sometimes the way that these are delivered into the field. And then we're obviously the customer for us is the farmers, and then this hopefully forms some form of virtuous circle where we can then measure the impact, match that up against our original intentions, and then feed back that through the loop back into further product development activities as time goes by. And saying a little bit more about the practicalities of it on the next slide, in terms of the multidisciplinary nature of what we do as a small core group, with this budget and with the number of projects we have, we're obviously operating through a large environment of collaborators. Overall, we're well in excess of 600 collaborators now over the years that we've been operating, and that spans that whole range right through from academic groups to some of the NGOs that we worked with very heavily, looking for our field presence in the early days. The research institutes, and ultimately, of course, the donors and governments, as I've mentioned. All of these groups seem to be necessary in this environment to make this function. And on the next slide, I could just say a little bit about a material evidence of this assessment that multidisciplinary activity is very important. We've recently established a new structure based physically at the ILRI campus in Nairobi, which is a coming together of three organisations, all of us funded through the Gates Foundation Livestock Group. So this is GalMed, ILRI, and one of the big international contract research organisations, clinical research organisations, ClinVet or ClinGlobal. And this is a physical embodiment now of where we believe we've got to in our understanding of the requirements, that working in these particular environments, particularly with the neglected tropical diseases, the capacity to work in these areas is quite limited, quite often because in other parts of the world where these diseases are not endemic, then we're talking about BSL-3, possibly BSL-4 environment. It's not always easy to find these locations, the understanding of the diseases, the capacity to work on them, and then to turn the research into products, and ultimately to do the development programs required for product registration. It's not, this in itself has proven to be quite a barrier. So this organisational structure, TASL, is an embodiment of that. So this is an end-to-end facility organisational structure that's been set up. And the intention here is that funders will be able to come in and fund projects that they're interested in themselves that can be taken through by this organisation, but also it's creating an environment for platform technology assessment in the context of these particular diseases, because there is another barrier recognised where new technologies are often difficult to introduce into the animal health sector, into the private animal health companies as a platform technology, and often we've found that they're not necessarily always being applied as we think they could most usefully be applied in this context, purely because they're competing with other development activities, maybe with a bigger market associated with them. So this organisation is set up to be able to test these technologies in the context of diseases, the neglected tropical diseases, and offer itself to commercial partners who may come in and wish to make use of it. So that's a relatively new activity that's been going on for the last almost 18 months now, and we have follow-on projects to take through with that. So on the next slide, just to give an impression of the sort of scale and interaction of some of these projects, I mentioned earlier we've had one of our few pharmaceutical product development activities came from a request a long time ago now, 14 years ago probably, from UK Aid to come up with a project that we thought would have high impact for a novel product development. And there was an observation that the trypanocidal molecules in use were developing resistance in the field. They've been used for many years, 40, 50 years now. And so a project was derived to develop a new trypanoside. And this just gives you some idea of the scale of these things. So basically it started life as a 6-year program with a multi-million-dollar budget, initially from DFID and then ultimately from DFID and the Gates Foundation together. And as operating as a virtual development organisation, trying to screen large numbers of molecules has required the establishment of a large interdisciplinary network. So now this is a slightly old slide of 6,000 plus. I think we actually ended up screening more than 10,000 molecules ultimately from various sources. And the objective of that was to deliver one lead molecule that would go forward into product development with some backup candidates. And on the next slide, it just shows a little bit of the way that we did this. So by having this basic core infrastructure that we could set up, which would do some of this screening, both in vivo and in vitro, by looking at the formulation activities with an academic group, in this case, the University of Greenwich. We also, because we wanted to look at in vivo activity, we had to operate in fly-proof facilities. So we then constructed 3 fly-proof facilities in sub-Saharan Africa, which are still functioning. You can see one of those up in the corner of the slide. And basically working with our partners to feed in existing compound libraries, largely from the human African trypanosomosis activities that have been going on with DNDi. So making use of that work to screen their libraries to see if we could actually repurpose these molecules into a new trypanoside. Now, as it turned out in this particular program, we had with the 3 lead candidates at the time, they run into a whole series of different issues, whether it's formulation or cross-resistance, etc. So the second phase, which is shown on the next slide, basically it's a similar approach, but now reaching out further into the wider community. So refining the leads that we took from the human side, but also now building in new compound libraries from other organisations. And this is across the board, whether it's academic groups or commercial groups, again, to screen these potential compounds through our centralised screening programme, again, using academic environments to do this work, ultimately to get to the point where we are today. So we're now in 2020. We started this program over 10 years ago. We've screened upwards of 10,000 molecules, and we now have one lead compound that's come out of that with a probably $45 million spend to get to that point. So it was just an example to show how complex these things are and how much interaction there does need to be to operate in this way. And of course, the point of this is that we have, in a part of our de-risking, is that we are not able to make use of the pharmaceutical company's internal resources when doing this, because these projects are competing with internal resource, and hence we need this huge array of collaborators. And again, on the next slide, just to demonstrate the broad scope of where we're collaborating. So obviously the donors, they're relatively limited in our case. We have quite a large array. This is just a short list of our major academic partners. We can operate globally, although the ultimate beneficiary of what we're doing are the small-scale livestock producers in the lower middle-income countries. We operate on a completely global basis, depending on who can actually supply what we need, whether that's commercial partners or academic partners. And on the next slide, it just shows that this is reflected in our board. So we have external advisory groups and an advisory board, and we take private sector and public sector members from the international organisations and also from academic groups who contribute to our overall direction and vision. And then just on the next slide, I mentioned that we're going through currently a strategy review, and one of the major barriers in the lower middle income countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is identifying what the real disease burden is for small-scale livestock producers. And I think a lot of people will be aware of the GBADS program that Jonathan Rushton is running through Liverpool University, the Tropical Medicine Group. But in the meantime, while Jonathan's compiling all of that, we wanted to refresh our view of what the opinions were really at the small-scale livestock producer level, because this is a key area for us to know what the burden of disease is, to make sure that we're targeting our interventions and the investment of the donors' money in the correct areas. So we recently ran a series of key opinion leader workshops to try to derive or refresh our priority disease list. And then also, in addition to that, apart from just observations on the diseases themselves, also to look at some of the other aspects of people's attitudes to their animals, to the diseases, to interventions, and how people actually value this as part of this activity, to try to get a holistic view of the barriers, not just the products that could be used, but also the attitudes of people to these interventions. And on the next slide, it's just an example of how we've tried to work our way through this type of program in the past of looking at particular disease burdens by particular segments, by species, and also within species, looking at different agricultural systems, because pastoralists' attitudes are very different usually to non-pastoralist farmers. Quite often the herd sizes are larger, access to information is greater, access to cash is also greater. So it's quite interesting to actually look at the differences in these areas, and also then to look at where we think the impact of these particular diseases is, whether there's a human health aspect to it. And then from that, we try gradually to work our way towards new proposals for new product interventions, which we can then make the case for funding and find partners for. There's a lot of debate about how this is done, but the most recent work that we've done is now published recently, so that's publicly available to see how we've worked our way through this. And the next slide just demonstrates some of the key partners we work with. We have gradually moved away from using NGOs as our end delivery agents to the regional pharmaceutical companies and some of the multinationals. And these are just some of the organisations that we've worked with, which should be familiar names to a lot of people in animal health and human health potentially. So we're working with companies who would be involved in diagnostics, in pharmaceuticals, in vaccine development, and quite a lot now of the larger animal health companies are also starting to take an interest in this. So again, I mean, on the next slide, we just talk a little bit about how we've set this up. So there is a term that's within anybody who's familiar with the Gates Foundation funding mechanism will be familiar with this term, global access. So the arrangement that we make with our commercial partners is that these technologies become theirs. They are the owners of these technologies. They're the people responsible ultimately for registration and pharmacovigilance, etc., in the field, and supply of the products through the distribution networks. And at that point, GalMed steps back. But the way that we try to guarantee that the original contractual arrangements for the companies to produce in a sustainable fashion and supply these products is through the global access clause. And this is basically, it's our insurance that the companies that we partner with that ultimately take ownership for the products and the businesses that we establish in these countries, we have a legally binding component of our contract, which is in perpetuity, that the companies must make reasonable efforts to provide these products at a reasonable price for the small-scale livestock producers. We've never had to invoke this clause, but it is there as an insurance for the donors that we are using their funds in an appropriate fashion to make sure that the ultimate beneficiary is the small-scale livestock producer. And on the next slide is just a couple of examples of some of the interventions we've been able to make. So this is in the area of Newcastle disease vaccines. We've now gone through the process of developing products which can be used in a more an easier fashion. So eyedroppers now much more amenable to use by community animal health workers and injectable vaccines, thermotolerant vaccines, fast dissolving tablets, small dose sizes, that sort of thing. And on the next slide, I think it's just trying to emphasize that I've talked a lot about the product development aspect because that's the area that I'm particularly responsible for. But we do, of course, have other components within the organisation to try to offer this end-to-end enabling environment to look at issues such as the use of paraprofessionals for product delivery in the field, the regulatory environment, etc. And I think pretty much my last slide there is just to summarise some of the achievements over the years. So we're across the board, we're doing the basic research activity in terms of screening right the way through to product development and delivery, registration of products, making them available. And ultimately, it's possible through our M&E function to calculate potential impact of these interventions, high-level figure there, a potential of deaths averted through these interventions, the number of doses used, and these are all measures. But again, just the last point I would make is, all of this is only really possible through taking this interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach and looking at all aspects of this, not just the product development, but how these products are ultimately made available in the field and people's attitudes to them. And I think at that point, I've probably gone over my time. And just the last slide to say thank you very much for the opportunity again to present something about GalMed, and I hope it's of interest.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was great to hear some more work about GalMed's activities there. So virtual round of applause. We will move on to our next speaker, which is Professor Joyce Tate, who's the co-director for the Inogen Institute based at the University of Edinburgh. I will just take this opportunity to remind our delegates, if you've got any questions for the speakers, do put them in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you for the invitation to give this talk at this important meeting. As the heading slide shows, I'm involved with the Inogen Institute in the University of Edinburgh and also the Open University. And if you look at the next slide, and the diagram on the right-hand side of that slide is the approach that we set up. It's an interdisciplinary approach that we set up when the Inogen Institute was first formed in 2002, describing how we wanted to operate. So we wanted to look at the interactions between three constituencies: the scientists and innovators in the left-hand side of that triangular diagram, the citizens and stakeholders on the right-hand side, and the policymakers and the regulators at the top. And that was based on research that we've been doing for about 10 years before 2002, where we worked out that for the innovative technologies we were interested in, which were mainly chemical industry and life sciences, that these were the three key factors that determined whether a new innovative technology would actually reach a marketplace at the end of the day or not. And the citizens and stakeholders exerted their influence as advocacy towards policymakers and regulators, and as markets for the scientists and the innovators. And then the policymakers and regulators interacted with the scientists and innovators through a governance process. And it was that triangular interaction that we have been following ever since as a way of, it's a way of doing interdisciplinary research more effectively, that you don't get good interdisciplinary research just by throwing a bunch of disciplines together and see what happens. You do need to have a kind of systemic overview of how to prioritize what you look at. If you don't have a discipline to guide you, you're very much open to picking up anything that happens in the external environment of this technology you're looking at, and you've got no sense of why you would pick one factor rather than another. So this was an attempt to set out the interdisciplinary framework that we'd be using for our research in future. And if you then look over to the left-hand side, that's the way we began to formalize what we were looking at from the governance point of view. So if you're looking at the interactions between policymakers and regulators and scientists and innovators through the governance process, and it's mainly regulatory systems, but there are a whole range of other ways of governing technologies through standards, through policy directives, various things like that, and guidelines that can make a huge difference too. So looking at the left-hand diagram and the process going from scientific research through translation to application, you have regulation coming in at the upstream stage. But nowadays we begin to think about how we're going to regulate a new technology before we even know whether it works or not. You know, we want to know how we'll govern this technology. And then there's downstream regulation on the left-hand side, where the people who are being regulated are interacting with the regulators to try and come up with a way of getting their product through to a marketplace at the end of the day. And there's a little rather crude diagram of a ratchet on the left-hand side there. And this is a regulatory ratchet, which has only operated in one direction. So every time something goes wrong with a new technology, we add something extra to the regulatory system to try and make sure that it won't happen again, but we never take anything away. And that process has led to a ratcheting up of the costs and the time scale of regulatory systems to a point where, you know, for a new drug nowadays, you're talking about 10 to 15 years in a time scale, and up to billions of dollars or pounds in the cost of that process and so on. And part of our research has been in the knowledge that this has happened. How can we make our regulatory systems more adaptive to the needs of new technologies? So in this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've done in the Inogen Institute on antimicrobial resistance, on drugs and diagnostics. Where are the problems and what can we do about it? And I think this is the area that Jeremy in his talk talked about as the enabling environment for the technological innovations that we're talking about. So on the next slide, we first began to make this claim that we need more proportionate and adaptive regulatory systems. We have to start changing our regulatory systems. We started saying that kind of thing in 2002, and it was extremely unpopular at the time. And there was a blanket reaction: you can't possibly change the regulatory system. It can't be done. It would take too long. And people would object. So many people would object in different ways that you couldn't change it. It couldn't be done. We've been making the case that, well, we think it could be done, and we think there are ways it could be done. That's been a large part of our research agenda in the Inogen Institute. So we think that you should be able to modify the regulation in the light of changes in risk assessment. So if you have an improved understanding of the technology and its impacts and the levels of uncertainty associated with them, or if there are changes in the policy and political context, you should be able to adapt a regulatory system. Policymakers need to understand their role in enabling innovation, as well as in ensuring safety and efficacy. So there's a new requirement now on regulators, not just to make sure that things are safe and effective, but they are now being required by governments to take account of how their regulation will affect the capacity for innovation in new technologies. The regulators should be in a process of balancing the risks and the benefits of new technologies to people and the environment. At the moment, they're very reluctant to bring a benefit-related calculation into the decision-making process. They really only want to focus on risks, and that leads to imbalanced decisions quite often. So we need to decision-making processes that balance the interests and values of all relevant stakeholders. In some areas, there is a tendency to over-focus on the most vocal stakeholders. So if there's a really vocal pressure group, they can have a really disproportionate influence on the way the regulatory system evolves, and it can be very much to the detriment of the technology. We think you could use standards creatively to adapt existing regulatory systems to the needs of innovative technologies. And we would suggest supporting the use of a regulatory science approach so that technology can be used to mitigate the risks as an alternative to regulatory constraints. So if you're talking about diagnostic tools where the diagnostic involves, say, a genetically modified microorganism, you can think in terms of biological or physical containment to make sure that that is not then treated as a deliberate release of a GMO to the environment, which would put it in a very disadvantageous regulatory context. So moving on to the next slide, how does this relate to the infectious diseases and AMR? And this is some summary results from one of our projects where we were, as a contribution to the O'Neill Commission report, we were asked to think about how the regulatory system could be adapted to enable pharmaceutical companies to develop more innovative antimicrobial agents, and that was our remit. But actually, when we thought about it, we added to our remit the development of diagnostics as well as the development of drugs, on the premise that one of the most important aspects of preventing antimicrobial resistance is to make sure that you give a drug to which the organism is susceptible when you prescribe an antimicrobial drug. So one of the things we found was that there had already been really considerable regulatory adaptation in the United States, and also to some extent in the European Union, to enable more rapid and cost-effective development of novel antimicrobial drugs. And one of them was that a change had been made in the guidelines for the Food and Drugs Administration. A change had been made in the guidelines for doing clinical trials on new antimicrobial drugs. And that change in the guidelines had brought the cost of developing a new drug down by 50%, 50%. And it was a very simple change. It wasn't a big deal kind of thing, but it took a very long time to persuade the regulator that they could do it. But once they did it, it wasn't that difficult. And that significant reduction in the cost of antimicrobial development had meant that regulation was now no longer an inhibition on company development of antimicrobial drugs. It wasn't an important factor anymore. But when we came to thinking about the need for rapid pen-side diagnostics being just as important as the need for new antimicrobial drugs, at the same time as the regulatory system for drugs had been becoming more proportionate and adaptive to the new technology, the regulatory system for diagnostic devices in the European Union certainly had become much more restrictive in the case for human diagnostics, and that was the developments for the medical devices regulation that have been taking place in Europe over the last 5 or 6 years. So the need to balance the development of the drugs and the diagnostics was an important systemic factor here, and the regulatory systems were not working in tune with both. While they were facilitating one, they were inhibiting the other. And that project was mainly about human disease and diagnostics and drugs, but we also made the case that you should not be focusing only on the human side of things, that you had to equally focus on the animal side of the things because of the potential for zoonotic transmission of diseases. So we considerably complicated our original remit and found some very interesting additional factors that needed to be taken into account if you were doing an interdisciplinary approach to this. I think that's one of the lessons taken away from it, that you don't always just answer the question you were asked, but point out that there are other important questions that you need to take into account. On the next slide is an example from a more recent project on, it's called the DIAL project, DIAL, Diagnostic Innovation and Livestock, I forget what the last word was, Diagnostic Innovation and Livestock, I think that was it. And one of the findings from that was that it won't be enough just to fix the regulatory systems. We were looking at animal diseases, and the knowledge that we had from the technology side that there were some very smart new developments coming through in rapid pen-sized diagnostics, arising mainly from synthetic biology and those kind of genetic technologies that could give you very rapid diagnostic procedures. That's certainly been illustrated recently in the COVID crisis. You know, the need for these rapid diagnostics to enable us to get ahead of the pandemic. But in practice, how it's been much more difficult to develop effective rapid diagnostics than it has been to develop vaccines in a short space of time. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about. You know, why has that been the case? Is it just because we've not focused as much attention on the diagnostics in the past? We've been focusing more on vaccines, and that technology was further ahead. I don't know the reason, but it's an interesting thing to speculate, because I think the diagnostics are probably at least as important as the vaccines and the drugs and so on in the long term. So what we found in this project was that regulation isn't really a major barrier to innovation and rapid pen-side diagnostics in the veterinary sector, but it could become a barrier in future and in the case of emergency need. And the reason it's not a problem at the moment is that the regulatory system for veterinary products is not nearly as well developed as it is on the human side. And veterinary systems are very often coming along after the human regulatory system has been put in place, and kind of piggybacking on that and beginning to, and often finding it easier to negotiate the regulatory system in the early days, at least, of developing the technology. So we found that the small companies that were in this area were often there because their main target was the much more lucrative human diagnostic area, but they were discouraged by the regulatory system in the human area, and so wanted to try it out first in the veterinary area and see how they got on, and then with a view to moving over into the human area. So it's quite an interesting area where veterinary diagnostics were actually benefiting from this kind of factor. We found that looking at the market for this at the end of the day, you know, how likely is it to be taken up by vets? And this was in the UK that we were doing this research. Found that vets are comfortable with their diagnostic capabilities and use diagnostic tests mainly to confirm a diagnosis already made and to reassure the farmer, I guess. there are so far few incentives for technology-based companies to develop diagnostic tests, and the tests that are available are not very well advanced. There are also some market sensitivities that we should be thinking about. So if you're developing a rapid point of care diagnostic, that's going to challenge the business models of the laboratories that currently process the current tests. And so you've got a really well-developed market who's going to resist the invasion or the disruption of their business model by this new technology coming through. And a positive factor in favour of developments is that the actors in the food chain are actually lobbying for mandatory testing before antibiotics are used on animals. And so this is not yet an important decision factor for vets and farmers. And that's another important factor that's affecting the market. So you've got all these different factors coming into play, affecting how the technology is being developed. And I want to go back to the point I was making at the beginning, that the regulatory systems are a really important and very negative influence often on innovative technologies. And we being action-oriented researchers, we've been thinking about what would we need to do to get a more supportive approach to changing regulatory systems by governments. So that became a long-term Inogen Institute focus on how to make innovation work better through adaptation of regulatory systems. The agenda item was that rather than adapting new technologies to fit the incumbent regulatory system, which is what we do today, you've got your regulatory system, you've got to adapt your technology so that it fits that regulatory system, change it around and say we need to adapt our regulatory systems to fit better with the needs of innovative technologies, and what would it take to do that? And one of the relevant factors there is that you have an EU innovation principle, which has actually been implemented in policy in the EU to improve the quality and application of EU legislation and to stimulate confidence, investment and innovation. And that's supported by the regulatory principles of proportionality and adaptation. And there are some policy documents referenced on that page. Those of you who are having anything to do with GM crops, gene editing, and that kind of thing, I can probably hear some hollow laughter, because that is certainly not happening yet in the EU in that context, but it is happening much more on the medical side of innovative developments in life sciences. And then if you move on to the next slide, we were given a grant from the British Standards Institution, because I've been saying at several conferences that we need to adapt our regulatory systems, and I think standards might have a role here. Standards might have a role to play in how we can do that. And so they gave us a small grant to say, okay, how would you do that? How would that work? And then they gave us a slightly larger grant to refine what we had said in our first report and to develop a more sophisticated report. And we came up with this schema, which is suggesting that there's that for one thing, if you see the technology readiness levels, that's TRL. If you're not familiar with that terminology, these are the extent to which a product is approaching market readiness. So from 1 to 3, which is basic research, to 8 to 9, which is ready for market launch. So there are various stages here. And one of the things we're saying is you shouldn't be starting to think about your regulatory system for a new technology until you're about TRL 6 to 7. And by that time, you will know enough about the product to know what the risks and hazards are going to be, and to know what the benefits will be as well. And you can do that balancing act. And before that point, you use pre-regulatory standards and guidelines to make sure that you're operating safely, but without the rigid requirements of a regulatory system. And when you get to the end of that process, you should really be saying, So to what extent do we need to have a formal regulatory system, or do we not? And maybe we shouldn't have a formal regulatory system. And then once your regulations are in place, you'll need to have different kinds of standards and regulations to guide developers through the regulatory system. And that's these post-regulatory standards and guidelines. And they will help the regulator, help the person being regulated to work out what they need to do to satisfy the regulators. And I just want to focus on that central bit of the diagram at the moment. And this was well received by the British Standards Institution and by the people we had involved in its development from companies and various places. But we still had the question, how are we going to get this into action with the UK government? And the next slide mentions an initiative. So I was appointed to the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology that advises the government on various science and technology issues. They've been heavily involved in the COVID crisis, for example. And I proposed an initiative based on the work we've done on adapting regulatory systems, which will address the challenges faced in adapting today's regulatory and governance system to meet the needs of 21st century innovation. This currently unaddressed translational deficit leads to an ongoing waste of natural resource that should no longer be acceptable. And there's an opportunity now for the UK to take an international leading role in setting and adapting governance systems. Now, that happened to land on the government's desk just as they were getting very interested in regulation, because they had a new realization of the importance of regulation for trade deals. And in the Brexit context, that then became something that they were focusing on very closely. So we had a very rapid response to that letter from the Council for Science and Technology. And if you look at the next slide, that government response resulted very quickly in a white paper on regulation for the fourth industrial revolution, which set up 4 different initiatives that were going to deliver on the recommendations that the Council for Science and Technology had made. And one of the recommendations is a strategic horizon scanning function. And that resulted in the setting up of the Regulatory Horizons Council, which started work last summer. And if you look at the last slide, I'm now a member of the Regulatory Horizons Council. So it's got 4 key areas that are prioritized: fusion energy and unmanned aircraft, which I'll pass over quite quickly. New genetic technologies is looking at how the current EU regulatory system can be adapted for things like agricultural applications of biotechnologies and industrial biotechnology, and then medical devices. So the medical devices aspect is human devices, but I think if there are issues with the veterinary side and diagnostic devices, I think they might be interested to hear from anybody who's got interest in that area. If you're aware of any regulatory problems that you think might be addressed by this initiative, then please let us know. And I think I've probably gone on for long enough, but I've been trying to demonstrate that this is the kind of thing you can achieve with interdisciplinary approaches where you're action oriented, and a lot of interdisciplinary approaches are. You can actually, even although it looks like a fairly difficult thing to achieve at the beginning, if you're persistent and you know your way around the system and you have a systemic understanding of what needs to be done, you can actually make quite a big difference in the policy sphere as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tate. So a virtual round of applause for you there. We're going to move on to just a brief panel discussion now to explore some of the themes that have been highlighted in today's talks and those themes that will transfer across the conference. So if I could just ask both of our speakers to unmute their microphones and take this opportunity to remind the audience, if they have any questions, please do submit those for consideration. Sort of quite interesting hearing the two conversations there. There's obviously a lot of interdisciplinarity going on already, but where do you think the action is kind of outside of that healthcare clinical setting, whether it's vets or humans that are, you know, your target sort of clinical partners, to enable these future policy initiatives? And where can universities perhaps be involved in those? I'll come to you first, Joyce, I think, on that one.
Okay, that's an interesting question, and I don't think you can generalize. I think you need to look at each issue as a separate problem with separate factors involved. So I think the factors that are important in a developing country are very different from those that are in place in a country like the UK or the United States. So I think you have to take that into account. I think the vets are crucial. I think they do need to understand the role they have a bit more strongly in supporting the kind of innovation that's needed to take their discipline forward in the future. I think they have an important role to play. Universities, as an academic, I hate to say this, but I'm constantly disappointed by the extent to which academic colleagues are not really interested in making sure that the research they've done results in a practical outcome for the real world at the end of the day. I think universities still don't give sufficient encouragement to people with that kind of mentality to stay in the academic community. I think anybody who has that kind of let's make it happen mindset is going to move out of academia and into a more practically oriented job. And I think that's a pity, and I think it's something universities need to pay more attention to.
Thank you. Jeremy, would you have anything to add to those thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. So just a couple of things I was jotting down while Joyce was talking there. So to my mind, a couple of things immediately I thought of were Joyce is talking about the regulatory environment, and the regulators are always weighing up risk benefit. You know, that's basically what they do when they're looking at anything that they're approached with. And I think there are a couple of areas that we've become aware of, for GMOs, for example. You know, a very globally diverse range of views about GMOs in our sense. You know, vectored vaccines are primarily the ones that we're looking at. And I think for me, that's an area where academics are essential. This needs the research community really to be developing data around this area to help the regulators. And I think from my experience of the European Medicines Agency, I think they have been very open to that discussion of actually looking at data that's being generated. But I don't know if that's the case all over the world. And certainly, you know, we're with the countries, the regions that we're primarily working in Africa and India, there's quite a lot of conservatism about taking risks to do with GMOs. I don't know that personally, I would like to think that could be a better informed view, which means data being generated and presented in an appropriate way. So I think that would be a nice interaction between the potentially an academic program to look at the real risks of GMOs, whether that's environmental risks or recombination risks, whatever that might be, to give the regulators that level of confidence that they need to be making assessments. Because I think Joyce mentioned at one point, there's a potential risk of losing innovation in these areas and not making best use of resources because people are either unclear how they can make these risk assessments or they're just nervous about taking any risk at all. And I think, if you put together all of the discussions, probably much more in the public domain these days around the risk of using the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines for COVID-19 control, some people, I think, probably are very concerned, and say, how can this have happened so quickly? Surely it can't be safe. And yet other people will give an opinion saying, no, it's, be assured by us, it's safe. So there's always this huge range of opinion generated. And I think that is a good area where the universities could become involved to start to generate this information, really, to build that database to help the regulators. Joyce, have you got your hand up? Is that?
Yes. That's an interesting point, and I agree that we need better data, and I think in the context of the risks that the UK government took in developing the COVID vaccines, my understanding, the regulators took, my understanding is that what they did was they took a big financial risk. So they allowed phase 2 clinical trials to go ahead before they had finished phase 1 clinical trials. And what that put at risk was quite a significant amount of government investment in the technology. So it's important that they weren't making the technology more risky. They were risking public funds to deliver a public benefit faster at the end of the day. And I think it's really important that we make these kinds of distinctions as well, because as the UK government regulators took some risky decisions, and I don't think that's quite what was happening.
Continue, Jeremy, please.
Sorry, I was just going to say, it's interesting also the context that these risks are assessed in. And, we often struggle with this discussion about low middle income countries. The comment is made, well, okay, maybe you can take more risk because it doesn't matter quite so much. Well, I'm not quite sure what people's thinking is when they say it doesn't matter. If it's human health that's at risk, it always matters. It's exactly the same. But I think there are some interesting different contexts when you assess these things. So if you were taking a slight risk on a vaccine in the low middle income countries where there is a greater requirement to supply a product outside of a cold chain. For example, given the issues around the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine for SARS-CoV-2, you may come to a different conclusion about that level of risk if somebody came with a novel approach which offered you some degree of thermotolerance and actually gave you a much better chance of the product being distributed, compared to another geography where supply chain thermotolerance is not an issue, for example. So I think there is, I'd say, data to be generated, but really just focusing people's minds on the actual context of the question that's being asked to better inform that cost benefit, that risk benefit analysis for the regulators. Sorry, Emma, you had another point on that, though, because I did have a question then about the other point that you made.
No, feel free to continue.
Okay, so the other one I had was this issue of reward. What is it that you have a system? You need to be aware that if you set a system up, it will deliver things that are based on the reward system that you put in place. And I think my observation from previous activities when I used to work for Pfizer Animal Health and then Zoetis in vaccine development before I joined GaltMed. And quite often when looking at technology transfer, my role at one time was to go out and talk to academic groups about the possibility of accessing their technology, their thinking, and it's in a product development in a private sector role. And what the observation quite often was that academics are not recognised or rewarded for patent applications, pure and simply. It's the very narrow way of describing it. But basically, if your reward structure is around publications and grant applications, and yet you want to do translational science, and largely companies will look at the package that they're being provided with as in that sort of handover phase to make an assessment of whether they're interested. And if you're providing a package that doesn't match up with what the commercial company has an interest in, e.g. some sort of protected intellectual property position, then there's a mismatch. And the European Commission was aware of this in the framework programme before, and I believe took an additional step to actually allow funding applications to move to a further step in the whole process. So not just that data would be generated and this could be made publicly available through dissemination, etc., but also that specifically IP protection could become part of these grant applications. And it was just the same question about, are you rewarding people? Do you reward people for what you want to come out of this system? And if you want publications and public disclosure, fine, reward people for this. But I don't think you can blame people in an academic environment for not being particularly interested in that translational aspect, the interaction with private sector, the exploitation of this, unless there is some sort of recognition for them doing that. And I think my conclusion when I was doing this before was that maybe the research institutes were more advanced from that point of view, that there was a clearer recognition, reward structure for people to protect their intellectual property, to create a package that could be exploited by a product development organisation. And so I think there are ways that you can address that. Not everybody, I agree with Joyce. I think that not everybody is interested in that, and quite rightly, it's a broad spectrum, the academic community. But I think that there should be recognition of the fact that if you want people to pay attention to transfer of their technology, you need to encourage them to do that, and having some sort of reward system in place would be good from that point of view.
Thank you. I think that partially addresses one of our audience questions as well, about what could academia do to address these barriers. And I think that point of incentivisation and recognition is definitely key to that. Joyce?
Yeah, that's prompted another thought, that part of our research has been to demonstrate that the more expensive and time-consuming the regulatory system, the more big multinational companies are in control of the development of the technology, because they're the only ones who can afford to go through that process. And so a sensible small company who's working in an area like that, their agenda will be at the end of the day to be taken over by that multinational company. And they will therefore tailor their innovation to the business models of the existing multinational companies. And that really holds back innovation. So if you, the conclusion from that then is, if you begin to relax the regulatory system, you will actually see a much more enthusiastic and creative participation of small companies and public sector institutes as well in the innovation process and in taking new products through to market at the end of the day. And we've got some evidence of that happening in Argentina, where they have already changed their regulatory system for gene-edited crops. And they're seeing a big, dramatic improvement in the number of small companies moving in with innovative new ideas into that area. So it's related to regulation again. It's one of the side effects of regulation.
Thank you. We have a question from the floor actually in this sort of area about engaging industry with research programs. So this will be sort of thinking of our academic colleagues. And a lot of the funding schemes do support that. The Connected Capabilities Fund itself was actually funded by Research England to sort of recognise this dialogue that needs to happen. So really for Jeremy, I suppose, you're sort of on the other side or somewhere in between perhaps. So how straightforward was it to bring industry into your programmes? And how early on do they engage? It's something we hear a lot in academia, that you need to have all of your stakeholders engaged at an early level, but it would be interesting to hear how that works in practice.
Yeah, there's a bit of terminology that people have different understandings of, maybe, Emma. And what I would say is the interface is a very interesting one, and having sat on both sides of that fence at one time or other, and as you say, probably sitting right uncomfortably on the fence right in the middle at the moment. I think the terminology that people use needs to be understood, and that's one thing that I would encourage, is if in technology transfer departments there's a possibility of gaining a common use of language between exploiters of technology and people creating technology. Because I think the biggest issue for me is just a lack of clear understanding. So the common aspect of this to a lot of these discussions is around what constitutes an interesting package for someone to take an interest in, where they may be prepared to invest in it. And quite often, in terms of vaccines, there are certain criteria that you can establish, and the way it would be done, I think, is to look at what a commercial company would normally do if they were developing something themselves, and then the volume of data that would usually require would be somewhere around what people might call proof of principle. And quite often, I think the mismatch in my experience is in terms of just the data. So not talking about protection of this at the moment, but just the data quality, quantity, etc., is around whether a company taking interest would view what an inventor may consider to be a proof of principle, which is quite a specific thing in a commercial sense, that it has a certain number of attributes that you would expect to find there. And quite often companies will say, actually, what you've got there is a proof of principle. There's something there that suggests this could be work, and then presented in the right way, blah, 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 blah. This could become something, and that, but it's only a proof of principle. And I think that discussion to get that common understanding would be a very helpful one. And I think over the years, people have tried to do that. I'm just thinking back to there was a nice meeting, the IVVN, International Veterinary Vaccine Network, held a meeting in London about this time last year, possibly the year before that, I can't quite remember. And there was a session within that specifically to talk about, we had various industry people coming and talking about what it is that they're looking for at different stages. Because, the big shift in cost usually, if we're just talking about product development here, in the veterinary sense certainly, and probably in human health as well, something equivalent, is when you really move into that development phase. And that's an absolutely key phase for companies. And I think in my experience, quite often, there is a feeling for people who haven't worked in a commercial environment that you can very quickly move into that phase. And the companies actually say, well, really you can't, because you need certain key things in place before we would be prepared to invest the money there. So the biggest thing for me would be just to get a good common understanding of what an interesting data package looks like. And quite often, as a parallel activity, that would involve some degree of intellectual property protection. But there is a realization there, of course, a filing for intellectual property protection is only as good potentially as the budget you have to support that, to continue to support it, and in theory to defend it. And that's always a very tricky area that's at that sort of interface negotiation in my experience, because the defense of a potential infringement is expensive, and it's hard for academic groups, I think, alone to have a big enough fund really to seriously be able to do that. So somewhere in that interface between filings and setting up an agreement, you need to come to and set up an agreement with an exploiter of the technology. You do need to work out who is going to take that risk of a potential infringement defence.
Thank you. So thinking along those lines, funding, obviously, with anything in academia is always a challenge. I think, Jeremy, did you say that GalvMed was sort of in the $80 to $90 million mark? Sadly, we can't generally request that type of funding from UKRI, but it's perhaps a somewhat controversial question. Is the way that funding happens in academia too focused to address these challenges? Joyce, I'm going to come to you for this one first. You were saying that you can't just say, what are the main actions? Who are the main people? That's a bit too all-encompassing. But I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of the funding in a very focused manner, and how that actually plays in the real world when you're developing these tools and technologies.
Well, I think, yes, there's a role for focused funding, and there's a role for the big GalvMed style initiative as well. I think we need big initiatives that work well, and GalvMed clearly is working well, and we need the smaller initiatives too. And at the moment, I'm acutely aware that if you want research council funding, then it has to be an academic project. Mm-hmm. And most of the projects I would want to fund come under the heading of translational projects. Mm. So if you want a translational project funded, then the intention is that you go to Innovate UK and they have a lot of very useful translational funding initiatives, but you cannot lead such an initiative as an academic.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be accompanied. And that means that the companies will quite happily put in proposals for something that's directly in their immediate interests, but they won't put in a proposal for something that's in the interest of their sector.
Mm.
That's not their business to take a lead for the sector. And there is a gap there that is very difficult to get funding for if you're an academic at the moment. And I'd like to pick up on what Jeremy was saying about intellectual property. I think this is a very important part of the big picture. And if I live long enough, once I've finished with regulation, I would like to take on intellectual property, because I think the IP system is at least as bad as the regulatory system in preventing useful innovation from happening. The way it works at the moment is not necessarily pro-innovation. In some cases it is, but very often it's not. And I think something needs to be done about innovation systems in the longer run. Mm-hmm. At the moment, I think what Jeremy was saying is right, and it's one of the other reasons why small companies can't innovate independently of the multinational.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joyce. Jeremy, would you like to add anything to that point?
Yeah, it's interesting what Joyce said at the end about the intellectual property system not assisting innovation. You know, it's a sad reflection, you know, if that's the case, because I would guess, you know, from what I've understood of this, that initially the system was set up to try to do the opposite. In fact, you know, I think the original idea was to try to create, you know, an environment to give people some reward for their taking the risk of investing. So that's a good point, I think, that Joyce has raised. You know, if that's actually not the way it's currently working, that it's actually acting as a disincentive and suppressing innovation. Yeah, that really is an area that needs looking at. So I was just trying to think about the questions about focus versus unfocused. I had two things. I mean, the 3 R's. Going back some time, and I'm sorry, Emma, I can't remember which of the UK organisations it was that contributed to the funding on the various initiatives on 3 R's and, you know, trying to encourage people to look at alternatives from a welfare point of view, an animal use welfare point of view. But to me, that maybe is an example of where I think, if you can call that unfocused, you know, it wasn't a particular project as such. It was an area of policy that was encouraged, I think, through a funding program that as far as I'm aware, worked well, and that it did encourage quite a range of different approaches to looking at how you could potentially reduce the use of animals in scientific experimentation, product development, etc. So I think that one would. That was a good example of maybe less focused approach. So it would, yes, if there are other areas, the sorts of thing Joyce was mentioning about trying to help the regulators understand particular parts of the whole process, that would be helpful to have that sort of unfocused funding. But why it was possible to do that, and it would be possible now, I don't know. I'm not quite sure about that. The other area that we've seen as a bit of a struggle with this attempt to encourage the pharmaceutical companies to take an interest in new technology and innovation is, and I think this is equivalent to what Joyce was suggesting about public funding bodies, is that sometimes it's quite difficult to get a platform technology assessed. We're aware that quite often companies, and possibly this is the same for public funders, want to see an end product that's delivered, which has some quantifiable value to it, possibly in a market or something. And this, I think, is where it's very useful to have an organisation like the Gates Foundation. You know, we are obviously extremely grateful in Goldman that the Gates Foundation can do this more risky investment, because we're all aware of platform technologies that are published or people contact us about. And I know when you then try and get something like that through a company, it's very difficult. The focus is on product, not on these blanket assessments. So we've been very lucky with the Gates Foundation, particularly with this organisation TASL, that they've funded, because that is part of that project very clearly, is to make these platform technology assessments. They're de-risking it. The data will then be provided across the board. It'll be published, and then people can come and make use of that for their own particular antigens in this case, because they'll probably all be vaccines, I think, vaccine platforms. So, how the public funders could do that, it may require a little bit of a change in attitude, because with the focus on something measurably deliverable with a dollar value associated with it at the end is maybe the wrong direction for these platform assessments. But maybe another call for something like stability in our world, where it's a big issue. That type of thing could be funded along the lines of the way that the 3Rs program previously did encourage us a whole series of different disciplines to get involved in that type of approach. But it is tricky to be very broad with these things.
And we've just had announced the setting up of this organisation. I think it's going to be called ARIA, A-R-I-A, which is the UK equivalent of the American DARPA funding initiative, looking to fund things like what they're calling moonshots. So really big. So that might be an area where in the UK we could begin to think about that kind of thing in the fairly near future. Yeah.
Great, thank you both. I'm going to return to our audience questions now. So this is actually a question for Joyce. Thinking about the implementation into health systems, clinical trial learnings in low middle income countries, and I think you've both highlighted that whilst it's global health, it's actually local differences or local inequalities even sometimes that you're then having to deal with when you're actually implementing solutions. So the question is really about how do you link into these correct networks? How do you make sure you're talking to the right people in these countries for that sort of health system engagement?
I think you do have to have someone who knows the local context. So it usually doesn't work if it's somebody from a developed country who, even if they've got quite close knowledge, they maybe won't have the trust of the local communities and so on. It's really important to employ local people to do that kind of initiative, that kind of aspect of the programme for you, to find out how to take things forward. In that DIAL project, we had a project to do with chicken farming in Tanzania and the use of diagnostic devices there. And the person who did that for us was Tanzanian herself, and she knew the local government people. She knew the people who were running the farming industry. She had a lot of local contacts before she went out there, and she was able with a really small component of the total grant to do some really interesting work in Tanzania, and to help us to understand what it would take to get veterinary diagnostics taken up by chicken farmers in Tanzania, and it wasn't a promising outcome at the time. There were very many reasons why it wouldn't be happening, just partly because of the ready availability of antibiotics to farmers who could just go to a local outlet and buy a drug which was probably adulterated or maybe even counterfeit, but it had the right label on it, and it was a system that would be very hard to break. And until you can break that part of the system, then you're not going to get very far with your need for diagnostic to tell you what antibiotic would be suitable for your particular infected chicken. It's not straightforward at all in these developing country situations. Yeah, but Jeremy knows more about that than I do. Jeremy,
would you like to add your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think what Joyce said at the beginning was absolutely correct. In our experience, nothing can replace local knowledge. It's been a key thing for us, and it's one of the reasons why, even in difficult times, when the funding hasn't been quite as positive as it is currently, we've maintained the desire to keep our regional offices, and we've had people there whose job is just in this policy and advocacy area specifically to address these issues of knowing what the local thinking is, knowing who are the key influencers, the key opinion leaders in these areas. Because I think certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, there are certain regulatory authorities in certain countries, or in our case with the veterinary medicines, with divisional departments of veterinary services. They can be important nationally. So you need to understand within countries, it's hugely variable. Quite often, from a regulatory point of view, on the animal health side, you find a veterinary medicine directorate equivalent, which is actually part of a human health department, where you wouldn't even, if you were just looking superficially from outside, searching on the internet or something, you wouldn't even notice it was there. So you do need to know these things, and local knowledge. You can't really replace that, because there's in my sort of superficial understanding of this, there are national voices, and then of course there are regional economic community activities which can be the focus of opinions around certain things, with standardization, harmonization of regulations, convergence, this type of thing, where there are also key opinion leaders. And then there are even larger organizations. For example, for us, the African Union through IBAR, they will also be organising and having opinions about livestock issues. There's a very interesting point I think Joyce touched on about quality control and who might be doing this sort of thing. The two things that I'm aware of, we tried very hard with the trypanoside programme. One of the issues there is counterfeit products, and this is a real issue for consumers, because it's a real issue for consumers because the product they're buying may not be what they think they're buying from what's written on the label. So it's important that that's addressed. But also the other side of that is, one of our goals is to try to encourage the pharmaceutical companies to take an interest in this market. And the two areas that they will routinely quote to us are real barriers for them to take this, to really get involved, is that the regulatory system is divergent and hard to understand. So some form of harmonisation of the regulatory system would be helpful. But the other areas around poor quality products and counterfeit products, and the fact that nobody's really following this up. And it may seem like a short-term gain if there are cheaper counterfeit products on the market, or poorly quality controlled products. But in the long run, if it's a disincentive for the introduction of higher quality, and you would imagine a higher price associated with that, it doesn't really serve anybody's benefit. So these are areas that we've tried to address with the regulatory harmonisation and the local quality control. It works, and it doesn't work. We don't yet have a mechanism really for making this truly work. And just as an example, with our trypanoside project, it's a huge amount of money invested in a new trypanoside. And alongside that, there was a program for equipping laboratories, one in West Africa and one in East Africa, to specifically go out and do this sampling to try to guarantee the quality. So the principle was that people would go out as a sort of secret shopper. They will sample from markets and from retailers, bring them back and look at the products, and then publish the data on which of these products are actually good and which are bad, and try to identify counterfeit products. And again, unfortunately, while this was funded by the programme, it worked well. So nice data was generated. OIE was published this in one of their technical bulletins. But of course, the key is the sustainability. And that's where it gets really, it's very interesting to talk about the sort of interdisciplinary and interdisciplinary nature of some of these things, and therefore the sustainability, because the model needed to be developed for these labs to then maintain themselves, obviously, in the long run, because none of these things can survive purely on donor funding forever. The point is we need an exit point from these projects, and it has to be when there's sustainability. And for both of these, the labs still exist, but it wasn't long enough to actually get them built into the thinking, so that now they're supported by, in some sustainable way, to actually continue to perform a very important service, which is, you know, checking for quality control. And the only other the only other area I can think of in terms of, you know, who influences these things and, you know, who you would go to get an opinion, I am aware that IAEA had a program for doing some sampling and quality control. So there are also the larger UN type organisations and WHO who could potentially be playing a role here as well, in terms of establishing standards and then potentially enforcing, maybe, but certainly encouraging the enforcement of quality control standards. But just to go back to the original question, Emma, yes, to know how to navigate around these environments, to my mind, it's local knowledge that's the key thing there. It's difficult to look in on these things from outside without a local contact.
Right. I think we've had some really great discussions, and I'm sure we could carry on exploring this subject, and it's really prompted those themes that are going to run through the rest of the conference this week. So if I could just ask both of you, what in your final sort of ideal world, we've got all of this collaboration coming, we've got changes, we have also got emerging new pandemics potentially, we've got changes to AMR and what's actually going to happen to sort of healthcare in the future. But what would innovation look like to you in 2050 in an ideal world? I'm going to come to Jeremy first, and then we'll move on to Joyce.
It's a very tricky question. I think maybe it's a superficial thing to say, but I think just thinking on the themes of what we've been talking about, a greater facilitation for good science to be brought into the public domain to inform discussions would be probably the greatest contribution. I think, it's hard to predict individual scientific innovation, but I think really to be able to bring good, sound, well-constructed scientific data into public debate for decision-making would be a really nice idea. Great.
And Joyce?
I go back to my regulatory theme. I hear far too many people say, I've got this really great idea to do something fantastic about animal diseases, but I'm not going to go there because I don't want to work with big multinational companies, or I know that there's a regulatory system that will stop it from happening, and there are just too many hurdles between me and getting there, and I'll go and direct my creativity elsewhere. And the really big challenges that we have today are often not being well served by academic communities, not because there aren't smart people out there with good ideas, but because for one reason or another, those good ideas are not getting through to actual application. And I think the most encouraging achievement in this last week for me has been to find this data from Argentina, where they made a change in the regulatory system for gene-edited crops, and they got tripling 4 or 5 times the number of small companies beginning to take innovations through the regulatory system to a market. I think the big multinational companies have their place, but if we can get a much more thriving SME sector that is exploring new ideas that the big multinationals don't want to touch, that is coming up with these kinds of new ways of doing stuff that can get through to a market, I think that would be fantastic, that we can tap into that creativity much more effectively than we're doing today. And I think you'd see enormous changes happen very quickly.
Fantastic. So it leaves me to say thank you very much again to our participants and to our delegates at home for their engagement in this session. We'd love for you to join us for the next conference session on Wednesday morning, which is on research, translation, commercialization and impact. More details are on our Eventbrite site, and recordings of this and all of this week's sessions will be available on the Bloomsbury Set website soon. So thank you all for taking part.
Thank you. Thank you.